Pivot or Perish, the essential guide to successfully navigating startup changes. As startup founders, we all know that building a successful business requires taking risks and trying new things. But what happens when your initial strategy isn't working out? What do you do when it seems like your startup is heading towards failure? Today, I want to talk about the importance of pivoting in startup success and why it's crucial to recognize when a pivot is necessary. Pivoting is the act of changing course in response to changing market conditions or other external factors. It involves reassessing your current strategy and making necessary changes to stay competitive and meet customer needs. Pivoting can be a difficult decision to make, but it's often necessary for the long-term success of your startup. Successful startups are built on the ability to pivot when necessary. Many of today's most successful companies, such as Airbnb, Instagram, and Slack, have all undergone pivots to get to where they are today. These companies recognized the need to change course and were able to make the necessary adjustments to stay relevant and competitive. Recognizing when a pivot is necessary is crucial to the success of your startup. Signs that it may be time to pivot include declining sales, lack of customer interest, or competitors entering the market with a similar product or service. If you ignore these warning signs and continue down the same path, you risk failure. Pivoting can be a scary prospect, but it's often the best decision for the long-term success of your startup. It requires a willingness to take risks and try new things, but it also requires careful planning and execution. You need to have a clear plan in place for executing the pivot, including timelines, milestones, and success metrics. The power of pivoting cannot be overstated. Successful startups are built on the ability to recognize when a change is necessary and make the necessary adjustments to stay competitive and meet customer needs. By embracing change and pivoting when necessary, you can position your startup for long-term success. Signs it's time to pivot. I would like to talk about signs that it's time to pivot and when to pivot versus when to stick it out. The first step in recognizing when to pivot is identifying warning signs that your current approach is not working. These signs can include declining sales, lack of customer interest, or competitors entering the market with a similar product or service. It's important to keep a close eye on these indicators and be willing to adapt your strategy accordingly. Once you've recognized these warning signs, it's time to assess whether it's time to pivot or whether it's worth sticking it out. This can be a difficult decision to make, but it's important to consider a variety of factors. Some questions to ask yourself when making this decision include: how long have you been pursuing your current approach? Is it still early days, or have you been at it for a while without success? Have you exhausted all possible avenues for success with your current approach? Are there any additional changes you could make that might lead to success? Is there a viable alternative approach that you could pursue? Do you have the resources and expertise to execute this approach successfully? If you've assessed the situation and determined that it's time to pivot, it's important to do so quickly and decisively. Develop a clear plan for executing the pivot, including timelines, milestones, and success metrics. Communicate openly with your team about the reasons for the pivot and what will be required of them to make it successful. In some cases, sticking it out may be the better decision. If you're still in the early stages of pursuing your current approach, it may be worth giving it more time to see if it gains traction. If you haven't exhausted all possible avenues for success, it may be worth continuing to explore those options before pivoting. Recognizing when to pivot is a critical skill for startup founders. By identifying warning signs that your current approach is not working, assessing whether to pivot or stick it out, and executing the pivot quickly and decisively, you can position your startup for long-term success. Types of pivots. The different types of pivots and some successful examples from well-known startups. The first type of pivot is a customer segment pivot. This occurs when a startup changes its target market to a different group of customers. For example, Slack initially launched as a gaming company but pivoted to focus on team communication, which led to their massive success. The second type of pivot is a product pivot. This occurs when a startup changes the features, functionality, or benefits of their product or service. An example of this is Instagram, which started as a location-based social network but pivoted to become a photo-sharing app that has over 1 billion active users. The third type of pivot is a business model pivot. This occurs when a startup changes the way it generates revenue, such as switching from a subscription-based model to an advertising-based model. A famous example of this is YouTube, which originally intended to be a dating site but pivoted to become a video-sharing platform, which led to their acquisition by Google. It's important to note that pivoting is not a one-size-fits-all solution and requires careful consideration and planning. Here are some successful examples of pivots from well-known startups. Groupon started as a fundraising platform for social causes before pivoting to become a daily deal site. Twitter began as a podcasting company but pivoted to focus on microblogging, which has now become a fundamental aspect of social media. Apple pivoted from being a computer company to focusing on portable music players and smartphones, which have now become an integral part of our daily lives. Pivoting is an essential aspect of startup success. By being open to change and understanding the different types of pivots, startups can adapt to the ever-changing business landscape and position themselves for long-term growth. Preparing for a pivot. In the world of startups, pivoting is often necessary to stay competitive and relevant in the marketplace. However, pivoting can be a challenging and emotional process for the team and stakeholders involved. So, how to prepare your team and stakeholders for a pivot? First, it's essential to prepare your team for the pivot. Communicate the reasons for the pivot, the new direction of the company, and what it means for each team member. Ensure that everyone is on board with the pivot and understands their role in achieving the new goals. It's also important to offer training and support to ensure that everyone has the skills and knowledge needed to succeed in the new direction. Secondly, it's crucial to prepare your stakeholders for the pivot. This includes your investors, customers, suppliers, and partners. Be transparent about the pivot and the reasons behind it. Provide updates on the progress of the pivot and the benefits it will bring to them. Be open to feedback and adjust your plans accordingly. Now, let's talk about managing the emotional toll of change. Pivoting can be a stressful and emotional process for everyone involved. Here are some tips to help manage the emotional toll of change. Communicate regularly and openly with your team and stakeholders. Encourage feedback and address concerns as they arise. Celebrate small wins along the way. This will help boost morale and keep everyone motivated. Create a positive work environment that fosters collaboration, innovation, and growth. Take care of yourself and your team. Encourage breaks, exercise, and self-care activities to help manage stress and prevent burnout. Pivoting can be a challenging and emotional process, but with the right preparation and support, it can lead to long-term success. By preparing your team and stakeholders for the pivot and managing the emotional toll of change, you can position your startup for growth and success. Executing a pivot. How to execute a successful pivot and offer tips for avoiding common mistakes during the process. First, it's important to conduct research and analysis to identify the right pivot strategy. This involves understanding the market, customer needs, and competitive landscape. Based on this analysis, choose the most suitable pivot strategy, such as a customer segment pivot, product pivot, or business model pivot. Once you've identified the pivot strategy, it's time to develop a detailed plan. This includes setting specific goals and milestones, identifying the resources needed, and establishing a timeline for implementation. Ensure that everyone on your team is on board with the plan and understands their role in achieving the new goals. Next, it's crucial to communicate the pivot to your stakeholders. This includes your investors, customers, suppliers, and partners. Be transparent about the pivot and the reasons behind it. Provide regular updates on the progress of the pivot and the benefits it will bring to them. Now, let's talk about common mistakes to avoid during the pivot process: not conducting enough research and analysis. Without a thorough understanding of the market and customer needs, your pivot may not be successful. Lack of clear communication with your team and stakeholders. Without proper communication, misunderstandings and resistance to change can occur. Not setting specific goals and milestones. Without clear objectives, it's challenging to measure progress and make necessary adjustments. Failure to allocate adequate resources. Pivoting requires resources such as time, money, and talent. Ensure that you have sufficient resources to execute the pivot successfully. Executing a successful pivot requires thorough research and analysis, clear communication with stakeholders, and a detailed plan. By avoiding common mistakes such as insufficient research, poor communication, lack of clear goals, and inadequate resources, you can position your startup for success. Measuring success pivoting can be a risky endeavor for startups, but it's often necessary to stay competitive and relevant. However, pivoting without a clear understanding of success metrics and progress tracking strategies can be futile. First, it's crucial to define success metrics for your pivot. This involves identifying the key performance indicators, KPIs, that will help you measure the success of your pivot. These metrics could include revenue growth, customer retention rate, user engagement, market share, or any other relevant metric. Ensure that the metrics are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART. Once you've defined your success metrics, it's time to develop a plan for tracking progress. This includes establishing a system for collecting data, setting up regular monitoring and reporting, and defining a process for analyzing the data and making necessary adjustments. Now, let's talk about strategies for tracking progress during a pivot. Establish a baseline. Before you begin the pivot process, establish a baseline for your success metrics. This will help you understand the impact of the pivot on your business. Regular monitoring. Monitor your success metrics regularly, at least once a week. This will help you track progress and identify any early warning signs. Data-driven decision-making. Use the data you collect to make informed decisions. Analyze the data, identify patterns and trends, and make necessary adjustments to your pivot strategy. Be flexible. Pivoting requires flexibility and agility. Be prepared to adjust your strategy if the data suggests that you need to change course. Celebrate milestones. Celebrate small wins along the way. This will help keep your team motivated and engaged. Defining success metrics and tracking progress during a pivot is critical to the success of your startup. By establishing clear success metrics, setting up a plan for progress tracking, and implementing strategies for data-driven decision-making and flexibility, you can ensure that your pivot is on the right track. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this speech informative and useful. In conclusion, embracing change and pivoting when necessary is essential for the success of any startup. It requires a willingness to take risks, embrace uncertainty, and be adaptable. But by recognizing the signs that a pivot is necessary, planning carefully, and tracking progress, you can navigate the pivot process successfully. So, I encourage you to embrace change and pivot when necessary. Don't be afraid to take risks, learn from your mistakes, and keep an open mind. Thank you for joining me today, and I wish you all the best in your entrepreneurial journey.